So last year when I gave this lecture, there have been quite a few developments, particularly with regard to Jerusalem and President Trump's recognition last December. So while I discuss the role of the United Nations, this year I'll specifically focus on the issue of Jerusalem. And if you like, tell the story of how the United Nations got involved through the long-standing dispute over the status of the city. Okay, so some things to think about as we go through our talk today is obviously how did the UN get involved, and another question might be why has the United Nations paid so much attention to this conflict? And then another question might be to think of why did the United Nations criticize President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as capital of Israel? And then to answer these questions, we have to look at the role of the United Nations predecessor, that is the League of Nations. So we'll begin the lecture by looking at what happened, what was going on in the Middle East just during the First World War, and how the League of Nations got involved, how the British government got involved, and how the mandate was established. We'll then look at how the mandate ended. So when the British withdrew, how did the United Nations get involved? This is when the United Nations adopted a partition plan and envisaged that Jerusalem would be accorded a special international status. Following this, we see the role of the United Nations getting involved in decolonization more broadly. And this is when we see the rise of the Palestine Liberation Organization as an actor. And we'll revisit the rivalry between the PLO and Jordan during this period. And then with the end of the Cold War, we see there's a peace process, recognition of Israel by the PLO and vice versa. But in some ways, we see the United Nations being sidelined in this period. And then at the end of the lecture, if you're still awake, I'll say something about this court case in which Palestine has brought its dispute over the status of Jerusalem to the International Court of Justice, otherwise known as the World Court, which is located in The Hague in the Netherlands. And they're claiming that the decision to recognize Jerusalem was contrary to the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and I'll explain what that is all about. So to begin with, it's worth mentioning that this conflict is older than the United Nations. Its origins go back to late 19th century nationalism, including anti-Semitism and colonialism, and this was a time when there was before the League of Nations, there was no real global institution. There was the Council of Europe, but beyond Europe, there was no international organization, no rules of law that applied equally between all members of the international community, and of course, most of the world was under colonial rule by some European power or another during this period. And there was no concept of equality between states, so it was hierarchy was considered the norm, and it was taken as evident that some states were more equal than others by virtue of their power and their size. If you want to make a very simplistic view of understanding what's been driving this conflict, we could say it's a clash between competing nationalisms, Zionism or Jewish nationalism and Arab nationalism. Due to European anti-Semitism, primarily due to European anti-Semitism, there was a political movement to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine in the late 19th century, when Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. And in order to establish this homeland, the Zionist organization, which was a public body registered in Europe, needed the support of a great power in order to do this. covered this in my book in a lot more detail, but in short, the government of Turkey was approached, Germany, but in the end, the British government was a country that would support the establishment of a national home in Palestine pursuant to the Balfour Declaration, which I'll mention shortly. Arab nationalism arose initially in opposition to Turkish rule, although it was mainly in the form of the Sharif of Mecca, who was who was appointed by the Ottoman Sultan to, if you like, take care of his interests in Mecca, and there was a movement during the First World War, also in support, in conjunction with the British Empire, to overthrow Ottoman rule in the Middle East. And the Arabs sought what the Sharif of Mecca desired was an Arab kingdom, not like a nation state. He was still an authoritarian ruler, so he desired establishing a kingdom over over Arabia and all of the other parts of the Ottoman Empire in what we call the Near or Middle East or West Asia. So you kind of had these two political movements, if you like, at that time. In addition, there were Western interests, beginning in the late 19th century, especially following the construction of the Suez Canal by an Anglo-French company, and obviously it remains a key trade route until this day. And of course, at that time, this was all part of the Ottoman Empire. If you look at the map on the right, so you can see the brown areas showing the extent of the Ottoman Empire before the First World War. You can also see the importance of the holy places and the pilgrimage to the Ottoman Empire. So Istanbul is over here, and then you have Jerusalem, Medina, and Mecca here. Again, also straddling that key route. Now, the most important of these holy places are Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. Of course, Jerusalem is also holy to Jews and Christians, as the place of the ancient Jewish temples, but also as an important place for the life of Jesus. So one of the issues that happened, of course, is that up until 1918, the Ottoman Empire was sovereign. But following the collapse of the empire during the end of the First World War, for the first time, the city, for the first time in very many years, the city fell to a non-Muslim power, if you like. And so one of the questions that arose was what to do with the city, was the holy places, who would control the holy places. So as you can imagine, there was much discussion and disagreement. And this is a map showing the SykesPicot Agreement, in which this was negotiated during the middle of the First World War, when the European powers were pretty confident they were going to win that war, and they envisaged at the end of the war dividing the spoils between themselves. So you've got the French sphere of influence in Area A, the British sphere in Area B, and then the Italians thought they'd take a bit of Turkey and the Russians would take Armenia. But the point, that the significant part to look at is this brown area here, which roughly corresponds to what is now today Israel and the Palestinian territories. And it was in this area where the great powers at the time envisaged establishing an international zone, where no one would have sovereignty, and where it would be like shared between the great powers. And the reason for that was because of the location of lots of different holy places in Jerusalem, but also throughout the Holy Land. So they recognized then that the area had a special status, if you like. So this agreement was a top secret agreement, but as I'll show you shortly when we look at a map of the mandates, we'll see that it corresponds, it's quite similar to the shape of the Middle East mandates established in 1920. So this was concluded in 1916. A year later, the British government issues the Balfour Declaration. So there might be a question of whether there's a contradiction there. In this declaration, the British government, called for, enunciated its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people, but made it conditional on it being clearly understood that nothing would be done that would prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish community. And I'll say a little bit more about this shortly, because during the discussion of the Balfour Declaration, when it was enshrined in the British Mandate, there was a complaint brought by the Arab community of Palestine and also the Vatican over the inability, in their view, to safeguard the civil and religious rights of the existing population in light of the call to establish a Jewish homeland. And I'm not trying to pitch my book, but if you're interested in all the background of why did the British government issue the Balfour Declaration, it's all covered in the book. And if you don't want to buy the book, you can download the first chapter for free on the internet, which I go through all the kind of details that happened then. And I can also answer questions if you want to know more about the background to it. Okay, so we'll look now at so that's kind of the background to what was going on in these different declarations being made, secret treaties, great powers scrambling to control this important part of the world. Now we're going to approach the next period, which is, if you like, the League of Nations. So the first, if you like, international experiment in administering in world government, if you like, and what happened to the holy place, what happened to Palestine, how the conflict kind of worsened in some ways during this period. So Palestine was one of the mandates that was established by the League of Nations. So these were essentially territories that were acquired from Germany and Turkey at the end of the First World War. And they were a new idea. Rather than its annexing territory and making a colony, the idea was that no one would have sovereignty over these territories. So power would be given responsibility for administering territory, but they were not the sovereign of them. On the map here, you can see the mandates. They're highlighted in orange. So you can see there's quite a few in Africa. These are the former German colonies, and in the South Pacific, also German colonies. And then in the Middle East, in the Near East, whatever you want to call it, here, this is the former provinces of the Turkish Empire. And the League of Nations, the Covenant of the League of Nations, is an annex to the Versailles Treaty. And it established a class of mandates. So it distinguished mandates between what they call Class A, B, and C. In short, if you were a Class A mandate, then it was expected that the administration of territory would be shorter. Independence would come sooner than later. Whether if you were a C mandate, you might be placed under mandatory rule for a very long time. So you can see that Palestine, and the reasons they categorize these states was what they understood as stages of civilization. So how well developed the territory was, how well educated, how literate the population was. So Palestine was considered, Syria was considered quite advanced. That's why it was an A-class mandate. But there's no deadline, there's no timeline. No one said, in 1948 there will be independence. It could have been 1970 or 1980. No one knew at that time. And the general rule, if you like, that was enshrined in Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. I've just got the first paragraph. It's much longer, but the idea was that these territories were no longer under the sovereignty of Germany and Turkey, but because they were not yet able to become independent, they would be placed under the benevolent tutelage of a mandatory power, and they were supposed to apply the principle that the well-being and development of such peoples formed a sacred trust of civilization, and that they would be accountable to the League of Nations for administering these territories. So again, no sovereignty, so that's key. No one has sovereignty during this period. Another issue, of course, is who would be the mandatory power of these different territories. Remember, Palestine, as it was then known, was supposed to be an international territory. It was a brown area in Sykes-Picot. So you can imagine a lot of countries were jostling to acquire this territory. It's quite attractive as a holy place. It's a nice part of the world. So you had lots of disputes with the Brits and the French in particular. But the Brits had the upper hand because they had the most troops in the Middle East at the end of the First World War. But there were also the Americans who were keenly interested in the region, primarily due to missionary activity at that time. And so President Woodrow Wilson sent a commission of inquiry, it was called the Inter-Allied Commission of Inquiry, colloquially known as the King Crane Commission, named after the chairs of the commission. And they actually, and this was part of President Woodrow Wilson's call for self-determination and the consent of the governed. So he sent these individuals to travel to different towns and villages throughout the region and to try to ascertain what the people really wanted. So there were petitions that were given to them, and it became quickly clear that they were very much opposed to the Balfour Declaration, and that they didn't trust the British Empire because they had issued the Balfour Declaration, and that they saw themselves as belonging to Syria, to the Bilad al-Sham. But Syria in those days would have included also what is now known as Jordan and Lebanon. So they saw themselves as a wider community. In the same year, the United States Senate refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty, and so the United States never became a member of the League of Nations. So the findings of this commission were buried and were not known for several years. Instead, what happened is the great European powers, the Big Four, actually also Japan, I should say, met in San Remo, which is in Italy, to carve up the Middle East between themselves as they had foreseen in the SykesPicot Agreement. And after a lot of wrangling, the French eventually conceded that Britain would be the mandatory power after all. And so this is how the Middle East mandates were established. And this shows you a map of what they look like. On this map, the pink area went to the French. That's Syria and Lebanon and Iraq. What was called Transjordan and Palestine fell under British rule. Not sovereignty, but a right of administration. And Arabia became an independent country, although it was reliant on British advisors at the time. And this map, actually, if you were to take a modern map of the Middle East and compare it to the mandates, they're all virtually identical. Little anecdote for those of you who are interested. One reason there was a lot of arguments during the negotiations between Britain and France over this boundary separating Syria from Transjordan and Iraq, and it was because of the construction of an oil pipeline from Mosul to Haifa. And that oil pipeline was in fact built and did operate for about 10 years until the Arab revolt in the 1930s, when it was blown up by rebels several times. Also, I should also mention that Saudi Arabia never became a member of the League of Nations, and there was a fight between the sons of the Sharif of Mecca and the Ibn Saud, who would become the first king of Saudi Arabia. The Ibn Saud won that conflict, and so the sons of the Sharif of Mecca fled. They fled north to establish a kingdom in Transjordan, which is now known as Jordan. And for them, having lost Mecca and Medina, Jerusalem became was essential to their legitimacy. to rule. So until this day, the State of Israel recognizes that the King of Jordan has a special role in the Muslim holy shrines in Jerusalem, which is basically the Haram al-Sharif. Again, not sovereignty, but administration, the right to pay for the Al-Kaf Foundation, to provide guards inside the mosque compound, not outside the mosque compound, and to restore it, that kind of thing. All right. There's also now we'll go back to the mandate. Another thing we have to bear in mind is in 1918, when the British government, or a year after the British government had pledged to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine, you had a lopsided demographic. The vast majority of the people inhabiting the country were not Jewish. They were Christians and overwhelmingly Muslim, but also as Christians. And even the Jewish population spoke Arabic at the time. So you can imagine that there would be some opposition to the policy. It wasn't just a question of immigration. The establishment of a national home is a political project. It's not like people are coming to live among you, they're coming to live with you, but the long-term aim is to establish another country. And so there was a lot of unrest, rioting in Jaffa and also in Jerusalem at the time. Now, the next slide is not so well known, but before the mandate was, so in 1920, it's agreed that Britain will be the mandatory power, but you still needed the consent of the Council of the League of Nations. They met in London in 1922, and it's at this point where the Vatican suddenly intervenes. Now, the Vatican is not a member of the League of Nations. However, Brazil, France, and Belgium were members, and they were not only just members, they were also members on the Council, which was the executive organ of the League of Nations. And they're also Catholic countries, obviously. And so what the Vatican did is they said, we're concerned about the Balfour Declaration. We can't see how this can be implemented without prejudicing the civil and religious rights of the existing community. And we're also concerned about the holy places as well. And so if you look at the mandate text, the British Mandate Palestine, you can Google it. There is I can't remember the articles, but there is 2 articles in the text about the holy places. So the idea was this commission would be established, it'd be sent, and they'd work out, an arrangement whereby all the different, primarily Christian religious communities would agree to resolve their little rivalries through this kind of unique architecture. And the idea was that there would be a chairman of the commission, and the chairman was going to be Woodrow Wilson. So when the Vatican heard of this, they got very upset. So they can't have a Protestant, in charge of, the future of the Catholic churches and shrines. So no agreement was reached. So it just the dispute was allowed to fester in the interwar years until we come to the end of the mandate, when a new idea is. Well, I suppose it's not a new idea, when this idea of internationalizing Jerusalem comes back. Okay, all right, back to what was going on in Palestine. So due to the rise of the National Socialism in Germany and the persecution of Jews in fact, in all of in Germany and Eastern Europe, there was a spike in immigration to Palestine beginning in 1933. And continuing really up until 1940, as you can see in these statistics here. Again, because of the sheer size of this immigration, again, it caused more friction with the Arab community, who feared that they would lose, the demographics would change, and they would no longer be the masters of their own land, if you like. Just before the outbreak of the Second World War, the British government publishes a white paper in 1939, where it says that it basically says that we can't carry out the Balfour Declaration anymore. It's become impracticable. It's led to unrest, and therefore we are rescinding it, and we are restricting immigration and land sales to Jews. That's why you see the huge drop in 1940. Another reason for the change in several reasons for the abrupt reversal of policy was due to a revolt, the Arab Revolt, which began with a 6-month strike and then quite serious fighting, mostly between Arab fighters and the British. Not so much. They weren't targeting. It wasn't so much a Jewish-Arab communal fight. Rather, the Arabs desired independence. Iraq had just been accorded independence, and they were mostly targeting British soldiers. So, a lot of Britain had to send a lot of troops to Palestine, which they weren't keen on doing because things were in the wider world were getting worse, and it's just before the Second World War. There's also unrest in British India. At that time, Britain relied a lot on troops from the Punjab, and the Muslim League in British India was saying, we're refusing to allow Indian troops to be used to put down the Arab revolt in Palestine. So this caused the Chiefs of Staff concern in London. Now that's the white paper in the background, and then, well, I'm assuming you know what happened during World War II and after that. So one of the issues, and we'll come back to these issues, but one of the before the white paper was adopted, there was a scheme which I want to mention because it has relevancy to the status of Jerusalem, and this is the Peel Partition Plan. It was never put into effect. It was discussed at the League of Nations by the Permanent Mandates Commission in Geneva, but there wasn't enough support for it. But in a nutshell, the commission was sent to Palestine to study the disturbances, the cause of the disturbances, and they said it was because of complete irreconcilable views between the Jewish community and the Arab community, and they suggested establishing 2 states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Arab state would be linked to Transjordan. So the Jewish state would be fairly small. This is the area where it would have been established. And the Arab state would have been larger and linked to and this map shows it as a distinct entity, but actually it would have been linked to Transjordan. Now, the important thing I want to highlight for today's talk is Jerusalem. So you can see that so the idea was the British would withdraw, with the exception of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and there'd be a land corridor to the port of Jaffa. So this is the first concrete plan. So we had SykesPicot, which is kind of the big area, the brown zone, and now we have another plan, slightly smaller, just focusing on Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and a little corridor to Jaffa. So again, it's this idea of treating Jerusalem differently to the rest of the territory. So after the end of the Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust, there's a lot of debates in Europe about what to do with the survivors of the Holocaust, whether they should be able to live, to immigrate to Western Europe, the United States, elsewhere, or whether they should be encouraged to go to Palestine. The great powers at the time had restrictive immigration policies, so they were encouraging the survivors to go to Palestine. Also around this time, the League of Nations, isn't really functioning. The last session of the League of Nations Assembly, before it dissolved itself, was in 1939. But on paper, it still existed. In 1942, Roosevelt and Churchill called for the establishment of the United Nations. It's formally established in San Francisco in 1945. And it's quite interesting because at that point you have two international, you have the United Nations and the League of Nations existing at the same time. So one of the problems that that had to be addressed is what to do with the mandates, because the mandates were a League of Nations, or a creation of the League of Nations, but that's going to be dissolved. Could the United Nations automatically have responsibility for these territories? And the answer was no. So the question is, how could the UN become responsible? So the mandatory powers would have to, if you like, transfer power to the United Nations, and there was a trusteeship council which was established to do that. Some countries didn't want to do that. The most famous was South Africa, which refused to place Namibia or Southwest Africa under the trusteeship system. Palestine was slightly different. The United Kingdom wanted to get out of Palestine as fast as possible, but they were aware that there was, virtual state of war in the country, and they didn't know what to do. The Arabs were opposed to partition, and the Jewish side was opposed to a unitary state because they wouldn't have their own. There wouldn't be a state because the Arabs were still the majority of the population at the time. So the United Kingdom asked the United Nations to come up with a solution, and so the UN, complied, and they set up a special committee, which spent most of the summer of 1947 studying, the problems of the mandate in detail. And they heard from the Arabs, and they heard from Jewish groups and organizations from all over the world. And they then had they couldn't even agree among themselves. So then they had a majority plan. So the majority called for partition, and the minority plan, which called for a federal state. Then there was another committee was established to look at both plans, but it was obvious that the majority plan was the one that's going to go forward. So partition had if you like, won the day, even though the Arabs were opposed to it, and all the Arab states surrounding Palestine were opposed to it. So unsurprisingly, that led to conflict. Now, the point I want to also focus on this is that Jerusalem, according to this plan, was not part of the Arab state and not part of the Jewish state. It was supposed to be what they called a separate body, corpus separatum. If you like, it would have a separate international status. So this plan is adopted by the UN General Assembly in November 1947. Because of the opposition to it, the conflict gets worse. Actually, before I do that, let's have a look at the plan. So this is a map of this is a copy of the official UN map of the proposed partition. Again, here you can see that the blue area was the proposed Jewish state, and the kind of orange yellow area was going to be an Arab state. Now, this plan differed to the Peel plan because it envisaged that the Arab state would be independent from Transjordan, so they would not be linked. So the idea was that the United Nations would welcome two new member states, a Jewish state, whatever they wanted to call it, as we know, Israel, and the Arab states, which I assume that we would have called it Palestine. And again, look at Jerusalem. It's here, and it includes not just the old city, as many of you may know it. It also included Bethlehem, but this time there was no land corridor to the port of Jaffa. But it was, again, so it's getting smaller, but it's still, again, treated differently to the rest of the territory. Now, the plan was never imposed. It was a very detailed plan. It's still very interesting to read the plan today. And it envisaged that the UN Security Council would enforce it. But we have to remember in 1948, this is the beginning of the Cold War. So we have rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. So interestingly, you can see both of them voted in favor of the partition plan. But the United States was suspicious. Why is the Soviet Union supporting this plan? And they soon realized that one of the reasons was, in order to enforce the plan, you need troops, you need soldiers. And since the Soviet Union is a member of the Security Council, you couldn't get a UN force into the territory without Russian troops also participating. And the Americans didn't think that was a good idea. So they came up with all kind of arguments to say that the plan isn't really binding and we didn't really intend to support it, and let's have a trusteeship plan instead. But again, I think it's still significant that the US voted in favor of the plan and voted in favor of an international status for the territory of Jerusalem. And I'm saying this because of what Trump has since said. So let's take a little closer look at what the corpus separatum looks like. So this again is a map showing you and actually defining what the corpus separatum amounts to. So according to the UN plan, the city of Jerusalem shall include the present municipality of Jerusalem, plus the surrounding villages and towns, the most eastern of which shall be Abu Dis, the most southern Bethlehem, the most western Ain Karim, and the most northern Shufat. So it basically includes Jerusalem, or well, today it would include all of Jerusalem. That is western Jerusalem, the old city, and it would include Bethlehem. So it is larger than just metropolitan Jerusalem, if you like. Okay, so what happened next? So despite the fighting on the ground, the United Nations didn't abandon its partition plan. On the contrary, they took further steps to try to implement it. And so in the summer of 1948, you had UN mediator Count Folke Bernadotte sent to the region. He was tragically killed in the war, but he came up with a progress report in which he again called for lots of things, a return of refugees, etc. But he also called for Jerusalem to have this special status. After his death in December of a year later, so what happens after 1948 is the city effectively gets partitioned between the Arab Legion of Transjordan and the Haganah, the fighting force, the main fighting force of the Provisional Government of Israel, as it was then called. But the UN still claims that it has jurisdiction over the territory, and it passes a resolution on the 9th of December 1949 calling for a permanent international regime. It's actually going further in some ways than the Corpus Separatum, which I didn't mention, which was seen as a 10-year ad hoc kind of regime. UN General Assembly Resolution 303 says, no, this will be permanent. And it's passed by a majority of states. And there are more proposals, and eventually there's actual statutes that's drafted for the international city of Jerusalem. Now, Israel and Jordan want to join the United Nations because they're not members yet. And so it's quite interesting to look at what the Israeli officials were saying to the United Nations before they became a UN member. And in a nutshell, they basically were kind of forced to admit that they didn't have sovereignty over the territory, that by supporting the UN partition plan, they had acknowledged and accepted that Jerusalem was not their territory, that it was under the UN umbrella, if you like. However, once they joined the UN, they decided to annex the territory. So did Jordan. So the Arab Legion kind of copied what the Israelis did. So the Israelis moved their parliament. So the Jordanians say, we'll hold a parliamentary session in Jerusalem. And so what happens is that the territory is divided into you have barbed wire and fences. You have no man's land. You have demilitarized zones. But crucially, the old city falls under Jordanian rule. And this was, this is where, so there are holy sites throughout the Holy Land, but the old city has most of them. So that's, that's seen as a key area. For that reason, no one recognizes. So Jerusalem is carved up between Israel and Jordan. It was supposed to be an international territory by the UN. When they call on states to recognize them, the states say, we recognize you, but we don't include Jerusalem. And that not only applied to the Jordanians, it also applied to the Israelis. So the United States did not move its embassy to Jerusalem until earlier this year. The reason being that they didn't recognize it had this special international status. And the same reason for all the other, why all the other embassies are located in Tel Aviv. There were a few exceptions, but that was the general rule. And the US went so far as to say, we can't even have official meetings in Jerusalem. They have to be in Tel Aviv. So the Israeli government had to build a special liaison office at one point in Tel Aviv. But obviously after so many years that wore down. But the general rule was we don't recognize, no one is recognized until recently, the annexation of Jerusalem by either Israel or Jordan. Okay. I see I'm running out of time. All right. Okay, I will go quite quickly through the next section, which is the United Nations and decolonization. But the historical stuff was important. So just keep in mind that Jerusalem is not resolved. So the United Nations gets involved in decolonization at the height of the Cold War. This is kind of a historical timeline. I've just to give you an idea of what was going on in the 1950s and 60s. And I've just highlighted, if you like, the Six-Day War here between all these other significant events. The Six-Day War was important, of course, because this is when Israel captured East Jerusalem from Jordan. But if you want to understand, the reason why I spent so much time on pre-1967 events is you can't really understand why Jerusalem had this special status if you don't understand what happened before 67, which is why I spent quite a bit of time talking about it. So what happens during the Cold War is there's competition, if you like, between the superpowers. At this period of time, Israel's very much allied to the United States. I mean, there was a lot of relations with the Soviet Union in the 1940s, but by the 1960s, it's very much on the US side. So is Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and before the Iranian Revolution, Iran. So the traditional kind of kingdoms, if you like, and Arab sheikhs are all aligned with the United States. The Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and the PLO end up siding with the Soviet Union. There's also, there's reasons for this, by the way, but I won't have time to explain. But that's kind of the nutshell. That's who they were siding with. And during decolonization, there was a competition for, when new states became independent, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia, the Americans wanted them to be on their side, and the Soviet Union wanted, them to join their camp. So the Soviet Union in this period takes on this kind of anti-colonial umbrella, starts, calling for the support of national liberation movements, the overthrow of the established regimes. And it's in this context that the Palestinian struggle becomes seen as an anti-colonial cause. So remember, up until 1967, the West Bank is under Jordanian rule. Jordan is a royal family. So beginning in the late 50s, we have all the liberation movements. And Fatah's the main, there's many Palestinian liberation movements. The biggest was Fatah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. You had the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. You had all kind of different splinter groups, but they all came under the Palestine Liberation, under the umbrella of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which kind of Gamal Abdel Nasser kind of originally established before it became nationalized as a purely Palestinian institution. And then in 1974, it's accorded the status of a liberation movement in the United Nations and is given special rights. As I said, Jordan is still controlling the West Bank up until 1967, which it then loses. And so there's a flood of support to the PLO. They think that Jordan has failed them. And even in 1970, the PLO tries to even overthrow King Hussein in Jordan. That fails, and the PLO is booted out of Jordan, and they end up in Lebanon. And they also get booted out of Lebanon, and they end up in Tunisia. And then they didn't get booted out of Tunisia. They didn't want to stay in Tunisia. They ended up coming back to Gaza and the West Bank. Black September was also the name of another infamous group that was responsible for the 1974 Olympic Games massacre. But I'll be going on a tangent for that. Again, I want to try and keep the eyes on Jerusalem. So during the 1967 Six-Day War, as I mentioned, Jordan loses the old city, so it loses East Jerusalem. And the UN Security Council passes a famous resolution, 242, essentially calling for a withdrawal of territory. But prior to this, there were two UN General Assembly, and again, I can say a lot more about this if you want in the Q&A. But prior to this, there was 2 UN General Assembly resolutions that were adopted in the summer of 1967, specifically on Jerusalem. And the reason why these resolutions were adopted in an emergency special session is because one of the first steps that the government of Israel took when it acquired the old city was to annex the territory, to establish a greater Jerusalem. They did it as an administrative measure, hoping no one would notice, but everyone did notice and responded accordingly. And so they called on Israel to rescind the measure it had taken, and then they referred to the status of Jerusalem. And this was understood to refer to the status of Jerusalem in the UN partition plan and in the trusteeship draft statute for Jerusalem. And the United States voted in favor of this resolution. They also voted in favor of a Latin American draft text. It wasn't adopted in the end, but that explicitly referred to the corpus separatum. And the US position in 1967 was that they've never recognized any unilateral actions by any states in the area as governing the international status of Jerusalem. In other words, they didn't recognize neither Israel or Jordan's steps to annex the city. The British government were more specific, and they said that while the Manchester government has since 1949 recognized the de facto authority of Israel and Jordan in parts of Jerusalem which they occupied, they did not recognize de jure Israeli or Jordanian sovereignty over any part of the area defined in UN General Assembly Resolution 303 from 1949, which designated an international status for Jerusalem. So that corpus separatum, the city of Jerusalem I showed you that was defined, that included Bethlehem as well. So they're saying that the whole area has a special status. In 1969, after an Australian tourists tried to set fire to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, this UN Security Council passed a resolution, insisting that all, well, you can read it on the left-hand side, but again, saying that, all the measures Israel had taken to change the status of Jerusalem, would not be recognized. In 1971, that is reiterated. Then there's the Camp David Accords. This is when Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. What people often overlook is that there was 2 parts to the Camp David. There was also the autonomy. There was supposed to be autonomy talks between Israel and representatives of the Palestinian people, not the PLO, but mayors, if you like, from the West Bank. But also there was an exchange of letters between Sadat, who's on the right, and Menachem Begin on the left, in which they set out their positions on Jerusalem. So Begin said Jerusalem is all Israel's, and Sadat said it's not, we don't recognize it as being part of Israel, and they referred to this special status that the city had. In 1980, during the discussions on autonomy, Galua Cohen, right-wing member of the Likud party, got a bill through the Knesset formally annexing, declaring in a basic law that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. This didn't really change that much. I suppose elevated the administrative measure from 1967 to a constitutional status in Israel's legal system, and of course attracted a lot more attention. And so, unsurprisingly, the UN Security Council UN Security Council responded with 2 quite strongly worded resolutions, and the Egyptian Parliament also then responded by passing its own resolution saying that Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine. So you had kind of tit for tat, although of course it's meaningless because they didn't control the territory. And in one of the resolutions, which was cited quite recently, the UN Security Council went so far as not just to say that it didn't recognize all these measures that had been taken to annex the city, they also called on all member states to withdraw their diplomatic missions from Jerusalem. So there had been about 15 countries that had missions in West Jerusalem. All of them were withdrawn to Tel Aviv. I think a couple of states moved them back up, and then in 2007, after the war in Lebanon, they moved them. The Central American countries, they moved them back, and then Guatemala, I think, most recently has moved it again. So it's a bit like a yo-yo effect. And this resolution arguably could be seen as binding, because it uses the word decision. And there is jurisprudence at the international court in the Namibia case that says that decisions under Article 25 of the Charter are legally binding. So you don't have to, you should distinguish what's binding in terms of law and what can be enforced. So I mentioned the autonomy negotiations, and this is when Menachem Begin wasn't keen on the idea of having a what he called a PLO state, or an additional Arab state established on the West Bank. So he made it clear that the Likud was flatly opposed to any withdrawal, and came up with this idea of granting autonomy to the population, but not to the territory. Jerusalem would be excluded. And in order to create facts on the ground, you see from 1977 a huge surge in the construction of settlements or neighborhoods, like small cities being established strategically in the West Bank, particularly around the old city. So it was a view to making a distinction between the rest of the West Bank and a greater Jerusalem area. In addition, there was a plan that was leaked to the United Nations called the Drobless Plan, which stated explicitly that the purpose of establishing the settlements was to reduce the danger of an additional Arab state being established. An additional Arab state meaning a Palestinian state different to Jordan. Right? So the argument then was that the Palestinian state has already been established, it's Jordan, and we don't recognize any self-determination for the inhabitants of the West Bank or Gaza. This view was primarily articulated by the Likud at the time. As we'll see later, the Labour Party would adopt a slightly different view. Just to make it clear that the United Nations has consistently condemned Israel's settlement policy. You can see they're rather tired. This is Donald McHenry on the left here, who was the second African-American ambassador appointed by Jimmy Carter to the UN after Andrew Young had to resign because he met with the PLO. And everyone knows who that's on the right. And you'll remember that in December 2016, the Obama administration adopted a strongly worded Security Council resolution against the settlements. Okay. So I mentioned the Jordanian PLO rivalry. In 1988, King Hussein was Ronald Reagan and Hosni Mubarak. He renounces his claim. He says, okay, we've had enough. The PLO, if you want the West Bank, you can take it. We ask for only one thing in return, that you will recognize our special role as custodian of Al-Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. And so that was accorded. And also in the same year, the PLO renounces armed struggle and indicates a willingness to recognize the state of Israel. So we then get to what I call the peace process, and which in some ways we see the sidelining of the United Nations also here. So in 1993, those of you who are old enough will remember the Declaration of Principles signed on the White House. This is Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, then chairman of the PLO, and Bill Clinton. Notably, it's a Labour government, not a Likud government. We wouldn't have seen a peace treaty with the Likud because they didn't recognize the PLO and they didn't recognize self-determination for the inhabitants of the West Bank. The Labour Party did. But unlike previous kind of big UN conferences, this one was the result of secret negotiations between the PLO and Israeli officials that took place in Norway. Actually, it began with a bunch of academics, and then it kind of went up into the kind of government level before it reached the very high political level. But it was constantly kept top secret in case of leaks. And there were direct negotiations, so they weren't going for any third party. And the UN was, everyone was kept in the dark, even the United States. Despite the image, it looks like the US was involved. The US had no idea until the last weeks of these talks. Now, significantly for the talk today, I just want to point out that Jerusalem is a final status issue. It doesn't say East Jerusalem, it says Jerusalem. So that means, oh, it must mean West Jerusalem as well, right? Or Jerusalem under Israeli law includes both. Final status issue means it's one of those files that the Israelis and the Palestinians are supposed to sit down and agree to. The fact that they haven't agreed doesn't mean that you can ignore the issue of the. And so you see a slight shift in statements by other countries saying, Jerusalem has a special status, but if the Israelis and Palestinians agree otherwise, they'll recognize that. And it's important to note that they never did. They discussed. There were lots of discussions on what to do with Jerusalem. Camp David at Taba, at Annapolis, and others that never became public. But they didn't agree, so it's not been agreed. So the assumption is it's not agreed, therefore the status quo continues. Okay, just quickly, one of the problems with the Oslo Accords was it didn't include Hamas, so now the PLO is having a rivalry with another faction from its own community. So they were fighting with Jordanians, now they're having a problem with Hamas. Hamas wasn't included, and that resulted in boss bombings going off at opportune moments of the negotiation, completely scuppered the whole deal. This is a picture of the interim agreement. You've got Joel Singer on the left here, who's advisor to Yitzhak Rabin. Here you've got Hosni Mubarak, Bill Clinton, King Hussein, Yasser Arafat, and Saeb Erekat, who's now the Secretary General of the PLO. The Oslo agreements envisaged that the idea was that there'd been an agreement reached by the 4th of May 1999. That deadline came and went. There was another negotiation at Camp David. That didn't go anywhere. All the time settlements are being built and relations sour, to put it mildly. And you have the eruption of the Second Intifada, where you have boss bombings, shootings, gunships being used. It was very violent. And then you have the return of Ariel Sharon and the Likud Party to power. Discussions are no longer focused on final status issues until much later, until 2007. The UN tries to reestablish tries to make itself more relevant by establishing a quartet comprised of the United Nations, the US, the European Union, and Russia. Tony Blair used to be the representative for the EU. He's no longer. He stepped down since then, and they had an office, and they would help. But it was very ineffectual. It wasn't very. Didn't have much of an impact. In the meantime, those facts on the ground that I mentioned from the Drobless Plan back in 1981 are being established, and this map will show you the settlements. There was also the construction of a separation barrier or wall, ostensibly to prevent attacks into Israel, although although the Palestinians argued that the wall served the purposes of annexing territory, and that would become the new border of Israel. And this map shows you the areas that are effectively being incorporated de facto into Israel, and that there's very little left in the West Bank. And this is my own opinion, but I think it's significant that there is no barrier or no physical barrier on the eastern side with Jordan. And increasingly, ever since the Second Intifada, Palestinians who want to travel, let's say overseas, they now have to go to Amman, Queen Alia Airport in Amman. They can't go through Ben Gurion. So it's kind of forcing, in a way, the West Bank to become more integrated with Jordan. In 2004, the UN General Assembly got involved, and they requested an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the legality of the wall separation barrier being constructed in the West Bank. The judgment was virtually unanimous. The court concluded that the settlements, it concluded that there was a correlation between the trajectory of the wall and the location of settlements. Sorry, let me go back here. And it said it looked like annexation. This is Jerusalem, so you can see the wall is going right round. So there are large settlement blocks all the way around here. Again, so the whole city, is kind of de facto part of Israel. So the ICJ ruled that the settlements were established in breach of international law, and they also said that the wall was contrary to international law. Interesting question is, what if the wall was in the 1949 ceasefire lines, the Green Line? In other words, built was in territory that no one disputes as part of Israel. It's unlikely the court would have said that would have been illegal. So the problem was where the wall was built, that it was not built on territory that was internationally recognized as part of Israel. It was built in occupied territory where Israel did not have sovereignty. Okay. So we'll jump now towards the most recent development, and this is the last part of my talk. This is an application that Palestine, I'll explain how Palestine could do that as well, brought against the United States of America just a few weeks ago, 28th of September this year. So in 2011, Mahmoud Abbas, who's president of the Palestinian Authority, who's chairman of the PLO, is also claims to be president of the state of Palestine, and he took steps to make that position clearer by formally applying for membership of the United Nations. Significantly, in the application to the UN, he referred to the 1947 UN partition plan and said, we are the Arab state in the plan. So the UN partition plan said, there would be two states. They'd both applied for membership in the UN. So it's been we're a bit late, but we're now applying, 50 or 70 years. How many years is that? A long time later. So the application was accepted, but there was no agreement on membership. No vote was taken. It was deadlocked. So they just said, we're not going to take a decision. So it's kind of just left there. In the meantime, Palestine applies to become a member of one of the UN specialized agencies, the United Nations Education, Social and Cultural Organization, headquartered in Paris. They become a member. It's significant. Why is it significant? Because only states can be members of UN specialized agencies. And then in November 2012, the UN General Assembly votes to accord Palestine the status of an observer state. So the PLO had this observer status in the UN, but now the Palestine was given the status of an observer state, the key word being state. So once it had been accorded this status, Palestine could start acceding to treaties like any other state can. One of the treaties that Palestine acceded to, I'll come back to this, was the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. And that's important because that's the treaty that forms the basis of the dispute against the United States. So in the 7th of December 2017, US President Donald Trump decided to recognize Jerusalem, describing it as obvious. Jerusalem is Israel's capital, nothing more than the recognition of reality. He referred to a US law, so that had been calling on all US presidents to recognize Jerusalem as authority, and then said that the State Department will begin making preparation to remove the embassy, but then he said he wasn't taking a position on final status issues, etc., etc. Although, as I pointed out, Jerusalem is a final status issue, so he was taking a position on final status issue. The Jerusalem Embassy Act was passed by Congress in spite of the opposition of the Clinton administration, and it contained a waiver saying that every 6 months, a U.S. president can say they're not going to implement the law on national security grounds, and every single president had done that until including Trump, actually. He also signed it in the summer of 2017. Then he didn't after that. No, he did sign it again, but then he didn't sign it this year because the embassy was moved. Again, he says Jerusalem. He didn't say You could argue if he had said West Jerusalem, it would still be legally problematic, but politically it would be more acceptable because then it leaves room open for recognizing a Palestinian state in East Jerusalem. That's what the Russian government had actually done. But he didn't. He said the whole of Jerusalem is Israel's capital. And a side story to this, there was some suggestion that there was an Arab peace plan negotiated by other Gulf countries, and the Palestinians would have to accept a suburb of Jerusalem called Abu Dis as their capital. So the Palestinians reacted very swiftly. It was condemned immediately. The Arab League condemned it. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation condemned it. It was debated at the UN Security Council. All 15 members of the Security Council, 14 of them voted in favor of the resolution, and the US was the only one to vote against it. A picture of the US ambassador here. The US position was stated as follows. She said, the president took great care not to prejudge final status negotiations. I can't fathom how that's possible. And then she went on to say that the position is fully in line with previous Security Council resolutions. Again, I think I've shown at least a few of them. That is not the case. If we look at what other countries said at the Security Council, we can see that they took the opposite position. So the British government referred to all the resolutions I've already referred to, saying that, our position is that the status of Jerusalem, our established position is that it should be determined between the two sides and that we don't recognize any sovereignty for the time being. The French government was the clearest, and they said, in the absence of an agreement and in accordance with the consensus that has prevailed for 70 years within the international community, France does not recognize any sovereignty over Jerusalem. And then they explained that following the June 1967 conflict, we did not recognize the annexation of East Jerusalem, which is occupied territory. So in a nutshell, Jerusalem is disputed territory because of all the stuff I told you about 1948. All that happened in 67 is the occupied East Jerusalem, that's occupied territory. So there are different categories in international law, but the point is no one has sovereignty over the territory, however, whether it's called disputed or occupied. The Russian government's taken a slightly different position. They've come out and basically said that they are more willing to recognize West Jerusalem as Israel's capital. It will be the capital of Israel, but they are also committed to East Jerusalem becoming the capital of a Palestinian state. The Russian government owns a lot of property. Actually, so does the German government, so does the Vatican, a lot of church property, state property in the city, and there have been discussions about the Russians perhaps opening in one of their compounds an embassy to the Palestinians, but they would only do that as a quid pro quo. So you could imagine them going to the Israelis and say, we're going to open an embassy in West Jerusalem, which would please them, but on condition that we can open an embassy to the Palestinian side. That hasn't happened, but it may do. Chinese government said, PRC said, we support the establishment of a fully sovereign and independent state of Palestine based on the 1967 borders. So their position will not change. So China doesn't recognize sovereignty, and presumably they recognize Israel and they have good relations with the PLO, so they'll do the same thing as the Russians and everyone else and recognize if there's ever an agreement. So after the Security Council resolution was vetoed, the UN General Assembly basically adopted the identical language that was used in the resolution. And significantly, and much to, well, not surprising, but the resolution refers to the Security Council resolution I cited earlier from 1980 that called on states to withdraw their diplomatic missions, but also said that they don't recognize any sovereignty over the city. As this upset the Israeli government because up until there'd been nothing since 1980 until 2017. No one had said anything about Jerusalem. You had some Eugene Kontorovich calls it an ossified international consensus, but now all Trump has done is he's re-established that consensus. It's now clear that nothing has changed, that no one recognizes Jerusalem. Donald Trump then tweets, he says that we've taken Jerusalem, the toughest part of the negotiation, off the table. Again, this seems to say that he has prejudged the final status of the city. It's off the table, right? Nothing to talk about. And then on the 14th of May, the US opens its embassy in Jerusalem. I was actually in the city at the time. It was just a coincidence. And I got to have a little peek of the embassy the night before. It's actually a pre-existing consular building. Actually, the US has several consular buildings throughout the city, as do the French. They have them in Haifa and Tel Aviv, they have them in Jerusalem. But they didn't have this specific status of an embassy, which is different. There's the old consular core of the Corpus Separatum, which I can discuss if there's time. Okay, so the point is they opened the embassy, and on the same day, but no one knew this, the State of Palestine, or the Foreign Ministry, submits what they call a note verbal to the State Department in Washington, saying that any step taken by the US to relocate its embassy constitutes a violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, read in conjunction with relevant United Nations resolutions. I should explain that that convention says that a state, an embassy has to be established on the territory of the receiving party, the receiving state. So it assumes that the state has sovereignty over that territory. And the argument, I assume, is that the US doesn't have sovereignty over it. The State Department never responded to this note verbal. On the 4th of July, Independence Day, they issue another note to the State Department notifying the State Department of the existence of a dispute pursuant to the Vienna Convention, to the optional protocol to the Vienna Convention, to which both the United States and Palestine are contracting parties. So the Vienna Convention has a second treaty which provides that if there's a dispute over the other treaty, you can bring that to the International Court of Justice. I don't know. I think it was done purposely on the 4th. I think whoever the advisors to Palestine must have thought, public holiday, no one's going to be around, because you have to give notice, and you don't want the State Department to react suddenly by, I don't know, what would they do? They could withdraw from the treaty, which is actually what they did, but they only did it like 5 days after Palestine had filed its application at the International Court of Justice. So you wonder whether someone in the State Department didn't inform the Secretary of State, or perhaps wanted this case to happen, or perhaps maybe secretly the administration, sees this could be an advantage, having this case brought before the ICJ. I don't know. Just to point out that the withdrawal doesn't take effect immediately, at least 12 months. So it doesn't affect it couldn't even affect the case, even if they'd done it arguably prior to the application. Then just last week, or what day is it today? Just a few days ago, the US changed the function of its consulate general, which no one discussed in the media. I thought it was really quite significant. So what happened in 1947 is you had this corpus separatum established for Jerusalem, but you had consul generals in the city that already had diplomatic relations when it was a mandate. There are 10 of them. Don't ask me just to remember all this. The US, Spain, Italy, France, the UK, Turkey, the Vatican. I think Sweden is also there. And it's quite interesting because Jerusalem the dispute was never resolved. They never present their letter of credence when they come. You normally give when an ambassador comes, he gives his credentials to the president of the country. But they never did that because they said, we don't recognize that Jerusalem is part of Israel. And so Ambassador Friedman, when he was in Tel Aviv, he obviously presented, because everyone recognized that's part of Israel. But there was this kind of unusual situation where you had this new US embassy, but you had the consul general. So it didn't make sense, because that's implying that the US doesn't recognize sovereignty over Jerusalem, and then you've got the embassy. So obviously they had to merge it. And this consulate general used to deal with Palestinian affairs. So and it was unusual because it had, as a consulate, it had direct access to the State Department. So it was a consulate, but it was more like an embassy in a way, in terms of communication. So the Palestinian leaders could have direct discussions with the State Department. Now, it has to go for Ambassador David Friedman, who doesn't have a very good relationship with the Palestinians, to put it mildly. All right, so to conclude, as I've shown, the United Nations has been involved in this dispute since even before the establishment of Israel. The status of Jerusalem remains unresolved since that time. both what we would refer to as West and East Jerusalem, including the consular court, the core of the Corpus Separatum, which included not just Jerusalem, but also Bethlehem. Arguably, all that President Trump has done by recognizing the city, he has emboldened and united the Arab and Muslim world on this issue. An interesting trivia, in 1975, there were 15 embassies in West Jerusalem. Today there are 3, if we count, following President Trump's declaration. So rather than all these countries flooding in to follow what the US has done, we haven't seen any real shift. Instead, Palestine has brought a case against the United States, and we have to wait for the outcome of that. Thank you for that rather longer talk than I thought I would give. Thank you.